drove in from Columbia, and I mean, it didn't rain all the way. It stormed all the way.
Oh.
And I was like, okay, I'm ready to get there.
No.
But it went fine. I mean, you know, managed, but it was plenty.
Plenty wet.
Hmm?
Plenty wet.
Hmm?
It's wonderful to see my son there.
I know.
And Cole's a professor, and
Yeah.
he's getting ready to attend his SAH.
Yeah, so really interesting choice.
Oh, yeah.
So looking at over that one too.
Yeah,
Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the first of 3 fall lectures of the 2025 Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter, St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library Lecture Series. On behalf of the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, we are pleased to continue our collaboration with the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter and host this lecture series. Before we begin, we ask that you all please mute your devices. Should you be joining us remotely and have any questions, please type them into the comments section. After our talk tonight, we will pose your questions and those from our guests to tonight's speakers, Carol Grove and Cole Woodcox. And now I'd like to introduce John C. Gunther, FAIA Lead AP, an architect who serves as president of the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter. He'll introduce our speakers for this evening's talk. John?
Thank you, Trent, for your welcome and for hosting this talk. Please know how appreciative we are to the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, for our continued collaboration for our Architecture Around the World lecture series. It is my privilege to introduce our friends and colleagues who are tonight's speakers. Carol Grove is an art historian who specializes in the study of American landscapes and architecture. She taught as an adjunct assistant professor in American art and architecture at the University of Missouri, Columbia. Her articles and book reviews have been published in Landscape Journal, Journal of Society of Architectural Historians, 19th Century, and the Journal of the New England Garden History Society. Carol has been honored with 2 Missouri Alliance for Historic Preservation Osmond Overby Awards for publication, the State Historical Society of Missouri Brownlee Fund, and the Foundation for Landscape Studies David R. Coffin Publication Grant, and named in honor of the late Princeton University Professor of Architecture and Pioneer Scholar of Landscape and Garden History. Her book publications are Henry Shaw's Victorian Landscapes, the Missouri Botanical Garden and Tower Grove, published by University of Massachusetts Press, in association with the Library of American Landscape History, 2005. Houses of Missouri, 1870 to 1940, Acanthus Press, 2008. And Hare Landscape Architects and City Planners, the University of Georgia Press, Athens, in association with the Library of American Landscape History, 2019. The last 2 co-authored with Sidney Milstein. Cole Woodcox was born in Salt Lake City, attended university in Utah, Italy, and England, but spent the majority of his life in Northeast Missouri. From 1987 to 2017, he taught English, art, and architectural history at Truman State University. On a personal note, our son Carl, a 2006 graduate of Truman State University, took an interdisciplinary course taught by Cole, and told me of Cole's brilliance at weaving insights from across disciplines to foster a deeper and more well-rounded understanding of topics. From 2017 to 2025, he was the executive director of the Council of Public Liberal Arts Colleges, a consortium of 30 universities headquartered in North Carolina. While living in Missouri, he served on the board of directors of the Missouri Alliance for Historic Preservation, together with Carol, and on the Kirksville Historic Preservation Commission. He nominated several Missouri buildings to the National Register of Historic Places and developed architectural tours for the Kirksville Arts Association. Recently returned to Salt Lake City, he now serves on the board of directors for Preservation Utah, works with its Historic Preservation Committee, as well as guiding tours of historic sites in the city. Tonight, Carol and Cole will talk about Buildings of Missouri, Buildings of the United States. This presentation outlines the process and culmination of research for the Missouri edition of the Buildings of the United States project, begun by Professor, mentor, and past president of the Society of Architectural Historians, Osmond Overby, and published by the Society of Architectural Historians and the University of Virginia Press. The volumes in this series are intended to be definitive guides to a given state's architecture. This guidebook's nearly 900 entries, 300 photographs, and 34 maps trace the period from pre-settlement to the present day, documenting the vernacular and high style as expressed by self-taught and professional architects in a variety of building types, from bridges to airports. On another personal note, as an architect of 43 years, I am deeply honored to have 3 of my designs included in this book: the Alberici headquarters from 2000 to 2004, the new powerhouse at St. Louis Union Station, 1986 to 88, and the Lambert Building Adaptive Reuse, 1984 to 86. And now, please welcome Carol Grove and Cole Woodcox as they present Buildings of Missouri, Buildings of the United States.
Hello, thanks for being here. It's almost like old home week. I appreciate you all. I appreciate seeing your faces. We're going to begin with some context, and I know that many of you already know this context, but we're going to begin with Osmond Rudolph Overby. And Ozzy, as he was known to his friends, his family, his colleagues, received his doctorate in art history at Yale in 1963, and then he came to the University of Missouri Columbia to the Department of what was then Art History and Classical Archaeology, and he's retired about 35 years later. He, as John pointed out, Ozzy was the president of National SAH, and also was an editor-in-chief of the Buildings of the U.S. project. He helped found numerous preservation organizations in Missouri, and was on numerous, probably more than he can count, advisory boards, and worked tirelessly in the field of historic preservation, including here in St. Louis, alongside Carolyn Toft, for example, when she was the director of Landmarks Association. He was involved in numerous HABS projects, for example, in particular in Missouri, St. Genevieve, and he contributed to many National Register nominations, as did his students. And this is one of his greatest strengths, which is as a teacher. He inspired dozens and dozens of students, and I will have to throw this in because the family was sort of proud of it. One of his students was a person who grew up to love architecture. His name is Brad Pitt. So Ozzy inspired Brad's love of buildings. Ozzy's lectures were inspiring, and I remember being in seminar classes, and he would lilt up on his toes, and it made you want to go home and spend the weekend reading Henry Russell Hitchcock and John Summerson and Nicholas Pesner, which is not really what you'd call fluff, but that's exactly the kind of inspiration Ozzy gave us. He was the voice of reason, and he was known for his humility, for his intellect. He was good at bringing together disparate people, at brokering relationships, which in terms of historic preservation is so important. And as a teacher, he was able to correct you without hurting your feelings, and I can attest to that personally, because I've experienced that more than once. One incident that reveals his character was when he was working on the Historic American Buildings Survey in Boston in the 1960s, and he charmed the fire department. Now granted, this was the 60s, I get it, but he charmed the fire department into helping the team to get to the top of Old South Meeting House so they could document the building to the best abilities. Cole and I also experienced that charm. We were invited to write a couple entries, and here we stand today. Author of many articles and books on American architecture, including his William Adair Bernoulli architect, bringing the legacy of Frank Lloyd Wright to St. Louis, published in 1992, here with the Kahn House in Ladue on the cover, and then also now Buildings of Missouri.
That's part of the American context for the Buildings of the United States series. There's also a British context. The Buildings of the United States project was inspired by the groundbreaking work of the German and British architecture historian Nicholas Pevsner. Pevsner's work, The Buildings of England, consisted of 46 volumes, which were published between 1951 and 1974. As an aside, The Buildings of Missouri, the Missouri volume of the BUS series, is also rather uniquely positioned in that it has both its antecedents in the work that Ozzie did in starting up the BUS series. In addition, the British historian, the architectural historian that I trained under, John Newman, was both a graduate student of Nicholas Pevsner and the chauffeur for Pevsner. He drove Pevsner around the county by county to look at parish church and stately home by stately home for certain volumes of the Buildings of England. So again, BUS is not, or BUS Missouri is not even like 6 degrees of separation from Pevsner, or from the very, very beginning, the envisioning of the BUS series then. The Buildings of the United States was first published by Oxford University Press and started with them in 1994. The original series included volumes on Iowa, just to the north of us, Alaska, Colorado, and they were rather not inspired covers, and you didn't hear me say that, and that will be edited out of the recorded version of this. They're a plain powder blue, and many of you may have a copy of them. They're plain powder blue cloth hardcover copy, and they're very, very clearly intended to be a library reference book. They look like a library reference book. There's nothing particularly graphic about the design for them. They were, however, then, the series migrated over to the University of Virginia Press, excuse me, and it's been published by them ever since the early 2000s. And there are now 28 volumes to date in the series. We'll talk more about other volumes in the series in just a second. That concludes the section then on the context. What Carol and I would like to move on to is to look at 2 more parts. The actual process, which for those of you who are interested in sausage making, will be the sausage making part. So how this book was actually put together, all 900 entries of it and 300 plus pages. And then the final section will be actually looking at the book. We'll give you an overview of the book. The actual process, the process for the book began in the 1990s, and it began very, 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 very much with Ozzie. That Ozzie began to, in the 90s, have some of his graduate students collect materials for putting together a Missouri volume for the Buildings of the United States series. And then also asked some of his graduate students, I believe they were also paid, to go out and do drive-bys of, here are a couple buildings maybe in Boone County or a couple buildings in Cole County that might be included in the book. Ozzie himself had incredibly extensive knowledge of Missouri. He had traveled its roads and highways and back roads and gravel roads. He camped at state parks in a pop-up camper with his wife Barbara, and together they took copious notes on buildings and sites and parks around Missouri. Many of those notes Carol and I inherited, and they were both frank and pithy and insightful and not infrequently brutally honest about a building. Ozzie devised the Building of Missouri's book's itinerary. It follows the published book, as Carol will talk about in a minute, actually follows the itinerary, the tour system that Ozzie laid out. One of the wonderful things about working on the project was that both Carol, as Carol alluded, we both were brought in almost 20 years ago or over 20 years ago, let's just say it, over 20 years ago, to write like a couple of entries. Like I was brought in to work on Kirksville, and then it sort of became 5 chapters. And you know, I think Carol started off with like Columbia, and then it became like 5 chapters, then as well. But that Ozzy had assembled packets from the 1990s, county by county, and what Carol and I were given were little manila packets that had in them like a MoDOT map for Boone County and a handwritten list frequently of these are like the 10 sites that really should be included in this county. Brochures, every county historical society that Ozzy visited, he had brochures from every state park, every county historical society then were included in them. And if there was a book, a little a pamphlet, that was in there as well. In addition, photographs then, his own personal photographs that were included in each of those packets. So yeah, there must have been 114 of them, one for each county in Missouri, but I don't remember ever really doing the count, just that I kept getting more and then a box and then another box, et cetera, et
I
cetera.
still have a box in my garage.
Carol has boxes. They were really very, very lovely, and it's nice to pull them out and see Ozzy's handwriting then, for these are the buildings that one should look at then in Grundy County.
And many of you know his handwriting. We didn't bring a photograph of that, did we?
No.
But, I mean, we should have, because it's so distinctive.
Distinctive. At any rate, in addition to that, then, for each county, Carol and I examined numerous documents and sources. For any of you who have been involved with the National Register for Historic Places nomination, or a cultural inventory, or a masonry review for restoration work then, or a county history, or a local archive, or a county website, or a local historical commission report, or have been involved with nominating buildings then for architecturally significant awards or books for awards, such as the AIA or Missouri Preservation, shout out then to Bill. We would personally like to thank you for all of those. They were invaluable in the compilation of the work that was done. In addition, we drove around numerous neighborhoods to do our own survey of buildings. These yielded to us a series of rough drafts, and as an asterisk, I'll go ahead and say this as well. This will probably be, if not the last, then certainly among the last of the books published within the BUS series that was not aided or generated by ChatGPT. That the volume itself was well into production for anything approaching ChatGPT came around. And so this will be, again, probably one of the last or among the last of the volumes published in the series before there was this sort of like type in a list of 100 buildings in Missouri and come up with them by these particular parameters, something that ChatGPT could do fairly rapidly now. The rough drafts were always guided by Ozzy's mantra to Carol and me, and that was to go ahead and look at patterns of use. What were the patterns of use for each county? What were the patterns of use for each neighborhood? What were the patterns of use for each city, etc.? Which in turn prompted Carol and me to consider asking useful to whom, useful for what, useful when, useful why, etc., as we began to curate ultimately the buildings that made it into the volume. As time went on, we encountered new demands from the SAH series as it changed from OUP then to the University of Virginia Press, that the series dictated what, in fact, we could do. One of those major changes was simply was the formatting. That these are sort of the early 2000 books examples. This is the book for Buildings of Arkansas, which you can see is standardized size, and I mean considerable. This is good. This is the Buildings of Texas, Central and Gulf Coast. So this is only a third of the state of Texas, and you can see the difference here then with it. Just by way, likewise, of an aside, the buildings of California and the buildings of New York have yet to be written for rather similar reasons. States like Texas or Virginia or Pennsylvania were simply so massive in the offerings that they were divided up into different parts of the different volumes, volume 1, volume 2 then for them. What happened as well was that that SAH and UVA Press also came out with individual cities as sort of a spin-off. So this is the buildings of Savannah, so just the guide to Savannah, the rest of Georgia in a separate book then with that. What finally came down to then is that, at one point there was the brief possibility that the editorial board was considering taking Buildings of Missouri into 2 volumes and simply splitting the state, so that there'll be a Buildings of Missouri East, St. Louis, the eastern half of the state, and the Buildings of Missouri West, Kansas City, in the western half of the state. That did not happen. And I don't remember its existing much longer than maybe a couple of months after Carol and I received the information. It was like, we're back to 1 volume, and make do with it. And what was made done with is now a 2.5-pound book. This. The format, likewise, as you can see, shifted from large format to should be able to go ahead and maybe carry this around. So, not quite a library reference book, into at least manageable and would fit into your car. I'm not sure it would fit into anyone's pocket, but certainly could go ahead and be intended to be more easily carried. So this 2.5-pound book then has 624 pages after very, very brutal editing that Carol and I will talk about in just a second. So continuing with the process.
Forgive this slide. These are farm fields outside Tipton. I just thought we'd have a little visual respite. So with time, as we worked on this whole project, there was this vital need to reframe our thinking from what began with courthouses and churches and National Register buildings, and to expand the narrative and more different types built by different people. Yes, vernacular was always included, but to expand the narrative. And so that meant some very different reframing of everything. And we had to review and edit what we had already before we did that. I mean, Buildings Fall Down. We're talking about how many decades now were we working on this ongoing project. Forgive me. Buildings fall down, buildings are rehabbed, owners change, tornadoes come through, and use is affected by things such as COVID. So everything had to be reassessed. In terms of working on a volume in a series, in this series, what we hold in our hand today is a result, and I know that you out there know and understand this, but it was this dance between authors, with authors and editors and outside readers and publishers, this ongoing back and forth. We were reminded often, the series is the boss. It's not up to us to make the decisions. It must fit, not that book, this one, yeah. It must fit what is expected by SAH at this moment in time, and University of Virginia Press as well. So we had to follow protocol. We had to make sure the work fit within the format. We had to make sure that there was a balance of type and style. And we're talking then about the architecture of the whole state. So, we can't have every great church in the book, right? And you know this, but it just became very painful to have to, make some decisions. But, anyway, so you have to think about that. There had to be a certain word count. Can't go over whatever it was. And so that was all a process that took quite a while and difficult decisions. In terms of photography, the whole issue of resolution and DPIs didn't exist in the 1990s. And all of Ozzy's photographs, which I still have in the box in my garage today, and I think some of them are still in a State Historical Society in his collection. They just weren't up to it, and so we had to. The reality was that we needed new photographs, and Karen Kingsley, the editor-in-chief of the Buildings of the United States project, said, "Oh, new photographs." of what do we need? And she said, of every building. And we're like, okay, of every building. I know that there's several of you out there tonight who helped us with that, so I appreciate it. We appreciate it, and we've noted that in the book. So, what we ended up with were hundreds of fabulous images, unfortunately reduced to the size of a postage stamp so that we can have this guidebook that fits into one's rucksack, is what Pevsner said, backpack, as Cole said, maybe a glove compartment or probably on your phone now. But it's kind of hard to see, what we're looking at. But tonight we'll get to see them in larger format, and that's kind of a good thing that we'll do this evening.
So there were multiple drafts, and those changed both on a monthly, certainly on a yearly basis, and then on a monthly basis, in addition to which there were great periods of rest, might be a polite word, and then we would hear occasionally from the press, we're under review, we're looking at things, and Carol and I would wait for right now, where are we going with it? For example, at one point, as she alluded to with the photographs, originally the photographs that were to be included in the book were all black and white. So all of the photographs that Carol and I had prepared, Hab's photographs or other photographs then, had all been done in black and white. And then, the suggestion mandate then came back of, no, we need color, we're reimagining, revisioning the volume, and we need the photographs taken in color, and then the subtle suggestion that they all need to be done. So even if we hadn't taken a photograph, it was going back then through buildings and seeing what had made final cut into the galley proofs to be photographed and rephotographed in color at that point in time. The volume was peer edited specifically by Richard Longstreth and by Carol Kinski, and then locally by Elizabeth Rosen, a historic preservationist then in Kansas City for the Missouri content, specific to the Missouri content then with it. And then their notes incorporated into further drafts. Although the maps were reviewed by Carol and me just for accuracy of making sure that the Wainwright Building was located where the Wainwright Building is and not suddenly on the banks of the Mississippi, things like that. And yes, those sorts of things did happen. And then reviewed again by UVA Press. The review of all the photographs, again, both by us and by UVA Press, both for standardization as well as accuracy, for similarly making sure that buildings had not been misidentified. And then it all came down to the final publication, great, fine, and Carol and I have since March been excited to actually hold a copy in our hands. And at the same time, thumbing through it and thinking, oh my gosh, how did that typographical error make it in there, or cartographical error make it in there, or photographic error make it in there? I'm not even sure where the cracks were, let alone how something fell through the cracks. But things did, and feel free to come up to us afterward, and we will be happy to point them out to you, including on the cover.
And to add to that, as is the case with many books like this, the information in this volume was dated the moment that we handed the manuscript over to the publisher, right? One of Ozzy's, a student who was a student and colleague of his, Carol Meeks, architectural historian, who wrote the seminal work on the train station as a building type in 1956, said 8 years later, when his book was republished, because of this horrible state of how train stations, they were being destroyed. He said, what began as a history has become an obituary. So yes, things change. What is in this book, is not what we'll find today at every site, but we have a record, and that's the best one can do, right? Yeah. So the book.
Part 3, the book. The The Buildings of Missouri is not a coffee table book, and nor is it a sexy book. It is a tool, it is a guidebook, and it's intended from the beginning to be carried around and go block by block or building by building, either ad hoc, as you want to go ahead and look at a particular site, or there are the tour formats that are suggested neighborhood by neighborhood, or one part of town into another part of town, county to county, then within it. It asks us to all go ahead and take a look at how buildings and built environment and landscape architecture are conceived, how they are negotiated, and how they are realized in their final forms as of 2023, 2024, 2025. And with that, Carol would like to go ahead and begin by reading the introduction to the book.
Buildings do not exist in a vacuum. Place informs their character. What is now Missouri has been understood differently by its inhabitants. Native peoples knew it as a ground without borders. Euro-Americans saw the land as territory held by the French, the Spanish, and again the French. It has been the West, it became the Midwest. To many, it is the South. Describing what Missouri is not, an anonymous 19th century traveler claimed it is neither east, nor west, nor north, nor south. Architectural historian Eric Sandweiss's description of where St. Louis lies is also a fitting description of the state as a whole, located in a, quote, murky overlapping zone between at least three of America's cultural regions, the South, the Midwest, and the West, end quote. Missouri has been a destination and a throughway for indigenous nations, explorers, settlers, enslaved persons, immigrants, migrant workers, and to this day, people starting new lives. All of them brought traditions. Many of them has helped assemble the state, the sites where Missourians live and interact.
Within the introduction begins to move through a series of themes that Carol and I talked about, identified, and then collated. And the first of those begins to look at the history of indigenous peoples in the state of Missouri, going back 10,000 years to first recorded human occupation residence in what is now Missouri, specifically at Grand Cave, figured here. And then that section of the introduction continues on up through the 9 nations that were in Missouri at the time of the Euro-American contact. The second of those themes looks at the history of Missouri from territory to actual settlement, and specifically looks at explorers, settlement, and migration. So it starts with Marquette and Joliet, and then moves on to the core of discovery, and then finally ends that section with urban centers and the development of urban centers in the 19th and 20th centuries. And then has this great view of Jefferson City and Jefferson Landing. The third of them looks at patterns of immigration and displacement. It looks at Black history in Missouri, the French, German, Czech, Italian, Chinese, Hispanic, and what they've contributed, which each group has contributed to the built environment of Missouri, as well as looks at displacement of those communities during urban renewal in the 20th century across Missouri. The next looks at self-taught to professional architects within the state. So it begins with early architects such as George I. Burnett, M. Fred Bill, and then moves on to the inclusion of later Kansas City-based architects such as Nellie Peters and Mary Rockwell Hook, and on to Harris Armstrong and William Bernoulli. This is one of those aspects that within this particular aspect was something that I think is always interesting in a book like this. It's a history and an examination of buildings of Missouri, but are those buildings by Missouri architects or architects who came into Missouri for 5 years or were brought in for one particular project, and how to balance that of where are all of these buildings are sited in Missouri, but what are the contributions or the effects of local architects then within that community, as well as the expressions and the influences of architects outside Missouri on the environment, and vice versa. The number of Missouri architects, St. Louis or Kansas City-based architects who, as a result of the railroads, will use like wholesale copies of buildings in Kansas City or St. Louis that suddenly crop up in Texas or Oklahoma, is likewise, this is Missouri architecture exported then along railroad lines. The next section looks at special merit. This is sort of a special awards section. Significant contributions that Missouri designers have contributed to both the state as well as architecture history. And so it looks at the landscape design and the urban planning of George Kessler, specifically this example then of the 1906 plan that Kessler does for Kansas City, and the work of Hare and Hare across the state. It then also looks at things like the Paseo in Kansas City, and the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. I think we're contractually obligated to mention that here in St. Louis. And then the things like the state capitol building, then we have a marvelous state capitol building, and it really is a miraculous story of its construction. And then the Wainwright building, and then the series of landscaping and CCC projects and state parks across the state of Missouri, in addition to the innumerable WPA projects across Missouri in the forms of county courthouses, post office, libraries, et cetera, that are constructed under the WPA. It then begins to look at the introduction looks at improving transportation from dirt roads and the paving of Missouri's roads beginning in the 1910s on up to the creation of Route 66, and then on into MetroLink and to the Kansas City light rail system. And then the final part of the introduction looks at documenting, preserving, and sustaining Missouri architecture. It begins, that part of the introduction begins by an examination of early scholarship by John Albury Bryan with Missouri's contribution to American architecture, published in 1926, which features heavily the buildings of St. Louis. We're grateful for that. The work of Charles Van Ravensway then, who did numerous works on Missouri, specifically the WPA Guide to the Show Me State in 1941, which coincidentally was the only other statewide guide to Missouri architecture published. So it's been 80 years since that WPA guide that Van Ravensway edits in 1941. We hope it will not be another 80 years before there is a third volume from a statewide examination of Missouri architecture. And then looks at the role of historic preservation here in Missouri, with a nod to the work done by Missouri Preservation, as well as local historic preservation commissions. And then also looks at the history of those projects, local projects such as the old post office here in St. Louis or the Wainwright building. And then ends by an examination, the introduction ends by taking a look at sustainable architecture, green architecture, and the role that Missouri and Missouri-based architectural firms have played in that.
So the book, 9 chapters. The overall organization of these continues the tours, the perambulations of Pevsner that he used in his buildings of England. And so it's divided into 3 tiers that move east to west along the state, and they are in sync with the pretty much in sync with the geographical divisions that we see here. We move from along the Missouri River from St. Louis to Kansas City, then across the southern portion of Missouri from Cape Girardeau to Springfield, and then finally across the northern portion from Hannibal to St. Joseph. There are also 6 sidebars throughout the book that expand specific subjects. French colonial architecture, the private streets of St. Louis, German building traditions, the Missouri River bridges in Kansas City, and state parks, and the Katy Trail. I think I have things a little bit mixed up here. And Lake of the Ozarks. Lake of the Ozarks here, Bagnell Dam, 1931, and here at Katy Trail Tunnel in Rocheport, this great engineering feat that you can walk through today and appreciate. So, chapter 1 begins with St. Louis. And, of course, we have included the monumental and the iconic Soldiers Memorial, behind that Civil Courts building, and not to mention this fabulous building we're in tonight, Cass Gilbert's Public Library, 1907 to 12, and of course the arch. And we didn't bring a photograph of the arch, but just so that you know, the arch, the book begins with the arch. It's entry number 1. So that anchors the whole, if you will. But we did, in this expanding of the narrative, Cole and I really wanted to grapple with how do we make this bigger and broader. And so we included, the flying saucer and buildings like this. Karen Kingsley loved this building. She said, oh, that's just, bring me more of that. But anyway, so this kind of building. And then sometimes favorites, you'd have to fight for those. This is one I fought for, the great Art Deco Park Plaza Hotel. Didn't make the photographs, heartbreaking, but you all know the inside of that wonderful entry. The entry and then inside that fabulous staircase, the Art Deco staircase. Absolutely an outstanding work here in the city. And then chapter 1 continues down south to include St. Genevieve. And Bill, this might be your photograph, I don't remember, but it includes many of the outstanding, iconic, if you will, buildings there, such as the Jean-Baptiste Ballet House, which is now the headquarters of St. Genevieve National Historical Park. There's much more in chapter 1, needless to say, but chapter 2. So chapter 2 is Mid-Missouri East, and it's a swath that includes Jefferson City and the Capitol, as Cole's already mentioned, the outstanding Capitol. This actually was the building that Ozzy wanted on the cover. That didn't work out that way, but that was his vote. Also, we've included, for example, the Inman Page Library at Lincoln University, that school that was founded 160 years ago by emancipated black soldiers, which is, its plan is a very clear Georgian organization and Georgian revival buildings. But then we have this new building by Parsons Brinkerhoff in 1997 that's supposed to sort of evoke this kind of Italian sort of flavor. I'm not sure what that has to do with Jeff City, but it's a very interesting, it's down at the bottom of the hill. It's a very interesting building to add to that collection, and it's worthy of seeing and absolutely brilliant use of the site in terms of how it's a low spot. Herman, great German brick, of course, but also the rotunda, which was used for agricultural fairs, and the inside of it, and there is a small little photograph in the book of the truss work inside, which is remarkable, and great German engineering in terms of how the seats around the edge are sort of built into the window wells. It's definitely something you want to visit. And then we have buildings such as St. John's Episcopal Church in Neolia, Pike County. Lustron houses. Yes, this one in Mexico, Ogden County. And the Southwestern Bell Repeater Station. This one in Wright City. You might have noticed how many? They're throughout, aren't they? Three of them, I think. Yeah, and this is a good adaptive reuse. Now the American Bank, well, maybe then the American Bank, I don't know, it's the American Bank. As I said, in Wright City, Warren County. So chapter 3, Mid-Missouri Central, moves west all the way to Jackson County, Powell Gardens, and Kingsville. That's Johnson County. Yeah, sorry. But anyway, so this is the Marjorie Powell Allen Chapel. It's Faye Jones and Maurice Jennings, set within the landscape overlooking this small lake. And if you know his work in Arkansas, we're delighted to have our variation on a theme here. But also Columbia architecture, such as the Firestone Bars Chapel at Stevens College, Eero Saarinen, this very crystal, perfect cube, entries on all four sides, absolutely distinctive stained glass windows. If you're ever in Columbia, I can take you there. We can go inside, and it's worthy of a trip as well, 1953 to 6. And let's see, what else do we have here? The Center for Missouri Studies, State Historical Society of Missouri in Columbia. This is by Gould Evans, then Gould Evans, and it was completed in 2019. Has since the landscape around it has grown up. I took this photo right after it was finished, completed. But inside, you see you have this very geometric spare building on the outside. On the inside, it's anchored right in the center by this very organic and natural wooden staircase. So it's sort of a contradiction, and it plays one against the other. And then lots of buildings in Boonville that we could have cited, right? But I included this one, the First Presbyterian Church on Main Street, because Ozzie and I were driving to a meeting, probably a Missouri Preservation meeting, and I was driving, he was riding, and I said, "That's the building I love." And he turned and he looked at it, and he turned and looked back at me, and he said, "It's got guts." And I said, "That's it, that is so right, thank you." Yeah, you're right, it does have guts. Yellow brick, fabulous, rich, wonderful. And it's built by a man, Thomas Bast, who was from Sedalia. He did Bothwell Lodge, and I think that he was involved with the hotel, the Bothwell Hotel there as well. But anyway, he's been called an architect, but he was very much a builder, hands-on guy too. So he's that's the next research project, maybe, Thomas Bast, anyway. And then how many, as Karen said, we need more farmhouses. And they're fleeting, but this is the Lewis Bruce Farmstead in Russellville, Montague County. It is this very intact collection of outbuildings and the house you see here. I didn't bring the image of the road in front of it, but this ribbon of road in front of it, I mean, it's just, it too is an example of what was built in Missouri. This is about 1870, and what makes us distinctive.
The book then moves on with chapter 4 of looking at the Kansas City region, and so those first 4 chapters frame that middle tier that Ozzie had laid out, of a tour, a perambulation, then moving from St. Louis and the Arch all the way across the Missouri River Valley, then through over to Kansas City, at least to the Kansas City part of the Missouri River Valley. And so it looks at things in the 5 counties around Kansas City that constitute the greater metropolitan area. So for example, the Krause House here at Platte City, which is a rather charming, typical Victorian vernacular form, and you can see what can happen with that when you apply high style very exuberantly. Let alone American and Missouri state flags all over it as well. But even the slate is pretty well done. On to one of the architecturally most significant buildings, or arguably, I would argue, the architecturally significant buildings in the state, with the Bully Brothers clothing building by the wonderful Lewis Curtis in Kansas City. And the importance of this building in introducing and popularizing the Hurton glass wall, and how Curtis basically approaches this as a proscenium arch, framing a glass curtain wall that's cantilevered out from the building itself. And beautiful building, and beautifully redone. into something like this then, which is the Community of Christ Temple, Community of Christ Temple in Independence by HRK. One of the ironies of the buildings of Missouri is that I, as a native Utahn, suddenly inherited this chapter and was asked to explain in 300 words or less the complex layered history of that lawn in front of the building. For those of you who do not know the complex and layered history of that, see me afterward, but the short version is that Jesus will be ruling from there during the second coming. So that lawn is pretty important. I'm happy to talk about that afterward. But yeah, as a Utahn and a familiarity then with Mormon architecture, the importance of this of the disputed site by various denominations over this location, and the construction of really a wonderful contemporary temple on that site. Next to that site, the grassy lot is the site. And then moving on to the inclusion of monuments across the state of Missouri, one of them being this, the statue, or the memorial then, Bird Lives for Charlie Bird, and a monument that helps to anchor the 18th and Vine District in Kansas City. On down to also including other important parts of streetscapes, parking garages. There are a couple of those in the book. One of the favorites being this one, the Kansas City Public Library parking garage right downtown and next door to the Kansas City Public Library. But the treatment of the veneer or the facade of the building is a veneer of books, both by Kansas City architects or by Kansas City authors or about Kansas City, as well as just popular books that you might want to check out at the local library. And then on to the other end of the state for the bottom tier.
Southeast region. Bonne Terre, town of less than 3,000 people, and it's a Memorial Public Library, not a Carnegie Library, but built with lead money, 1905, and this very classic box. It has been. There is an addition, a recent addition, but you're driving down the street of this small town, and all of a sudden, bam! It's like, oh my gosh, where are we? So they're very lucky to have this remarkable classical building anchoring one of their corners. And then there's Caledonia. I don't know if you've been there or not, but it's near the Arcadia Valley. It's in Washington County. Scots Irish settled. This is just one of the little buildings on Main Avenue. Of course, repurposed Continental Petro service station in the 30s. Caledonia is an interesting town. Willard Duncan Vandiver taught there at a school, Bellevue Institute, no longer standing for a while. But he was also a U.S. House of Representative. He was in the U.S. House of Representatives, and it's his speech to a group in Philadelphia where he says, my state raises corn, cotton, cockleburrs, and Democrats' frothy eloquence does not convince me. This is an edited version. I'm from Missouri, and you have to show me. So perhaps the show me state comes from his speech. If you see a photograph of this fellow, you can just imagine him saying those words. But anyway, so this little town, Main Street not paved until the 40s, has some remarkable federal-style houses on it, brick, and other buildings that are remarkable as well. And then we have the old Cotton Exchange Bank in Kennett, Dunklin County. An example of farm banks that had the money in them and were built in very small towns, probably the most monumental building in those towns, besides the church, perhaps. I'm thinking of like Concordia, for example, has an example of an outstanding bank like this. Versailles has one like it. And so Kennett and Dunklin County, this is their version of it. And if you haven't been down to the Boot Heel, we all need to go. I mean, when I was there, first time I must admit, I thought I knew farm fields, but these are cotton fields to the horizon, to the horizon. And you could talk about the history of those. We will not tonight. But anyway, so the Boot Heel, a distinctive and different history. And here, Cape Girardeau, many buildings we could include. Here's the historic B'nai Israel Synagogue, 1912. It's been used and has sat empty a little bit in recent history, so that's been a little bit of a stressor on it, as we know how that works. If you don't use a building, it falls down. And this is by Thomas P. Barnett. So it's a kind of a jewel in their collection as well. And then South Central Missouri, Chapter 6, down to the Arkansas state line. And really what this is about, for the most part, is rock, cobblestone, as the main, and sandstone, flat sandstone as the main primary building material. There's this great, locals call it sugar rock, because it has there's that quartz in some of it. And so sugar rock is one of the terms they use for it. So we have the Wagon Wheel Hotel in Cuba, Crawford County, Route 66 again, 1930s. St. Joseph Church, White Church in Howell County, by an A.F. and Arthur Stander. Flat sandstone, giraffe rock versus this rubble. And then the houses down in Thayer, Missouri, which were built by generations of two families that always included one of them, a flower of stone up in the gable as their logo or trademark or their signature, if you will, on their houses. And then Wilmore Lodge at the lake, Lake of the Ozark, built in 1930, LeBaume and Klein for Union Electric at the dam, Bagnell Dam. Now is the headquarters of the Chamber of Commerce, and there's an excellent exhibit of historic photos on the creation of the lake there that's worthy of seeing if you go that way.
That second tier concludes, Chapter 7 concludes that second tier of across the southern part of the state by looking at buildings in the southwest region around Springfield. And one of the highlights of that is the Jasper County Courthouse in Carthage, which is constructed in 1894 and designed by Max Orlop. And it's a demonstration of sort of good, solid 19th century exuberance and confidence in a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and just how Richardsonian or classicizing you could go ahead and treat Richardsonian Romanesque at the same time. And then moves on to look at two-part commercial vernacular buildings like this in the Osho, the Burgers Walk, also from the 1880s, 1890s, and its adaptive reuse. Also a really good example of the work, the preservation work that's done across the state. Into Bruce Goff's Freeman House in Joplin, one of the three Goff houses here in the state. If you're not familiar with Goff's work, I encourage you to take a look at it. The house is fantastic. All of his designs are very, very creative. This one incorporating then the bracing for the roof, or the suspension for the roof. It's actually like a chimney that you're looking at the center of the house, the carport. The roof of the carport is suspended, and then the incorporation cut out for the tree. It doesn't really show up in the photograph, but one of these beautiful pieces of turquoise chunks of turquoise glass that are actually set into stone taken off the site as well to go ahead and cap a meandering stone wall of uneven height, then varying heights, and then capped off with these chunks of blue glass stone from the turquoise back over on the side as well. So the polychromy within the house for the white stone. And then moves on to also include such late 20th century examples of public architecture as this, the Harry S. Truman Visitor Center at Warsaw, and this overlooks a reservoir, so there are good motor boats and water skiers going up and down the lake right underneath this. Karen Kingsley, the editor-in-chief for Buildings of the United States, really liked this building. She felt it looked like a spaceship, a 1950 spaceship that sort of landed in Missouri. It does. Sorry. Last year, northern tier of the state, Chapter 8 starts off in Hannibal, and that northern tier basically follows the Trans-Missouri Railroad, the first railroad across Missouri, then from Hannibal then to St. Joseph, then in Chapter 9. So starting with Hannibal in Chapter 8, and then finishing with St. Joseph in Chapter 9. It includes a number of important buildings, very, very interesting types of buildings, including this, the Union Covered Bridge at Paris, Missouri. This, I've got to say, after working with 600 buildings, 900 buildings then at Missouri, this remains one of my favorites. I love this bridge. I loved it the first time I saw it, and it still holds up after looking at varieties of examples. But the engineering included in Missouri bridges, that was a whole other area. It's why it ended up being a sidebar in the interior, placed within Kansas City, and looking at the importance of bridges in Missouri's history. This being one of them from the 1870s, that part that again was alluded to in the introduction on from dirt roads then to the Metrolink on how transportation is worked on across the state. This is an early example of a local need to go ahead and bridge a river, and all of it done with pins. They're wooden pegs and dowels that are used to go ahead and support the trusses of the bridge. It's still standing today and has withstood floods. And is really one of three remaining extant examples of covered bridges in the state. Next up are an examination of one-room schoolhouses. There are several in the book. Several in the book. Two of them here from Chapter 8. This is the Lincoln School in Canton, and then the Plum Grove School in Laclede. Both of these record examples of how Missouri's architecture and its treatment of educational architecture both reflects out in small rural areas the history of segregation and segregated education across the state, as well as the importance of a one-room schoolhouse before consolidation in the 1910s into larger elementary schools, public high schools then across the state. So that both of these buildings play an important part in understanding that history. Next. And the Blease Military Academy in Macon, Missouri. This is a nod to the many military schools across the state. This one of the largest. This is all one building built for cadets and classrooms, and then repurposed now as public housing within Macon. As Carol mentioned, we were encouraged to include as many the re-examination of the book and moving away from churches and courthouses into as many farms and farm buildings, outbuildings as possible within it. And then this is one of the round barns within the state. And so the Smith Farm outside Kirksville. And then the final chapter, Chapter 9, the buildings around St. Joseph, and looks at the example of the wholesale row right in downtown St. Joseph to show St. Joseph's importance as a commercial center rivaling Kansas City throughout the late 19th century. And these wonderful buildings that are built, that are designed by Eckel and Mann, who dominate the northwest quadrant of the state as architects. This is another Eckel and Mann building in Nottoway County. And again, big favorites. Who doesn't enjoy good roadside architecture? Big Pump, I mean, even the name makes me smile now. Big Pump. Big Pump just outside King City. And this fantastic example of Art Deco, a little like razor blade thin example of Art Deco in Trenton, Missouri, which was originally constructed as a 5-story hotel because somebody in the 1930s thought that Trenton would have a promising future in the hotel industry and created this wonderful design, polychrome design then for it. And that again, concludes the book in asking us or showing for us what Missouri architecture has been, what it is now in the present, and points us toward in the future. Carol?
But we'd like to say in closing that in introductory art history classes, we have to make things simple as possible. And for example, when we talk about Versailles and France, we say it's the work of Louis Laveau and Mansart, right? Well, it's not really just their work. That dismisses the fact that it takes countless armies of teams of masons and glazers and painters and sculptors and gardeners and laborers, et cetera, to create the place. The team that contributed to this book may not be quite as large as the one at Versailles in France, but it was as vital. And it's people who helped with research, with writing, and with photographs. And I know 5 of you, I think, in the audience tonight, and we will not read off the names, but we want to thank you so much, and we do thank you so much in the book. And it wouldn't have happened without teamwork, and that is an Aussie Overby way to do things. So we just want to say thank you, and on that note, we'll be done. And I suppose we have questions, can answer questions if you have any. Peter?
You answered my first 2 questions, which
Okay.
was how did you go about selecting the buildings?
Yeah.
But roughly.
Did we answer that?
Well,
Did we
sort
really
of.
answer that, Peter?
Sort of. Do you have any guess about how many buildings have been looked at, photographed, researched in the last 30 years? And obviously they didn't all make it into the book. So, so what happens to that list? What happens to those photographs? What happens to all that research?
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, well, part of that can be expanded in SAH's Archipedia
Archipedia.
online. We can write longer entries and we can add more buildings. And they invite you to add photographs, and I'm not quite sure what the method of that is at this moment, but the point being, some of that will be added to that. And I think, like, for instance, Ozzy wrote this fabulous entry. We start out, and we're writing these monumental, it's personal, and he wrote this fabulous entry for the state capitol, but, it was 5 pages long. It's just, so I keep thinking, well, let's get that published somewhere. So, good job for you, Peter. That's your next project.
Sure.
Yes. Was that
Sorry.
did we
Was
answer?
it-
Did we
We
answer?
answered your first 2 questions. What were the other?
Was there a third one?
Oh, no, I was just asking about, how did you work with the editors to figure out which buildings to actually get included?
Back and forth.
Back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth. And I mean, in a very amicable, friendly way. It was, early drafts. One of the comments that I vividly remember from early drafts was one of the external editors, then reviewers, then who wrote back and said, "No more iHouses."
Yeah, or what was it, the architecture of one, was it Herman or whatever? Oh, what a bore. Oh, well, wait a minute now.
Yeah. And so it would turn into, I tend to operate with spreadsheets, so I would have a spreadsheet then of, what are all the Eckel and Mann designs then, what are all the Haynes and Barnett designs, etc., so that we could simply go through and how many I could sort it, how many county courthouses do we have, from what periods do we have them then, how many round barns are in here then, how many barns are in here, or etc. then with it, and we could begin to go ahead and work with that as a sense of building type, architect, location, use then, etc. within it.
And we have some of those old files, we have files. When I was looking at my folders on my computer before I came, going back to 2016, and even before that, the handwritten ones, right, Mimi? So it's there for the next grad student or team of grad students to take care of. Jeff, did you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned that you had to update black and white photos to color photos, but obviously there must have been quite a number of black and white photo buildings that were lost since then. Do you include any black and white, or do you make mention of lost buildings that, couldn't make the book because you didn't have a color picture?
That was part of the dictate. We only include buildings that are standing.
Standing. And
That you
visible
can
from-
visit, that you can visit.
Visible from the
As a
street,
publication.
visible from the street.
So as much as you wanted to, I mean, we were able to mention a few things in the introduction, like I wanted to include fabulous Arrowhead Lodge at the lake. Now it's gone. So the series is the boss.
Answer that.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I noticed that Moshe Safdie's Kaufman Center made the cover. Who
Yeah.
made that call?
The 5 photographs on the cover were all selected by UVA Press. It was their team of editors who put together both the jacket design, the jacket covers. They took the photographs that Carol and I had sent in, the however many, 600 photographs that Carol and I had sent in. And then they reviewed all of them, and then reviewed both the 5 for the jacket, as well as the mise en page then within the book. That too, the series sort of dictated. We've gone 2 pages with just text. We need more illustrations, sort of thing. Then
And this is a marketing decision. You know
yeah,
what I mean?
total marketing.
I mean,
The one thing that Ozzy, very, very, very early on, very, very, very early on, had communicated that, his choice was the Missouri State Capitol. And shall I say?
go ahead.
Carol and I, the one thing that we were hoping we tried to push them in the direction was, and in all due respect, please don't put the arch on the cover of the book. And there are enough of those out there. Right? And what they wanted was something that was distinctive, both for Missouri, that this says, hey, this is Missouri, but also within the series, that they've got more than enough rural church books, covers, or this, etc. They didn't have anything like that, and that was part of what happened.
And of course, it's blue.
It was, I took the photograph.
It's not really blue. We know this, right?
It was, I was there on a lucky night when the Royals played, and so it was illuminated with blue. Had it been there on Chiefs, the cover would have been red, right? So yeah, the Royals won, congratulations, it was blue.
Is that it? Yes,
Is the
ma'am.
book available in bookstores?
Well, that's UVA's Press's job, and I haven't heard where they are on that.
Yeah, on the web, you can order them off the website, yes.
But I mean, I would hope that local bookstores,
UVA,
yeah. And I know that Kim, I forgot Kim's name, editor at the State Historical Society in Missouri in Columbia, said she got a copy, a reader's copy, and I think is writing editorial about it, whatever. And hopefully they have it, but I have not taken time to see where. So SAH, I think, is the best place
You
to
didn't
go.
bring any copies with you.
No, I mean, I have one extra. Okay. Thank you all for being here. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Well, I just have one more question.
Yes.
Is every building that's illustrated in the book, were you able to actually track down its history or its architect or all the background? Or is there something that you just love, but you have no idea who did it or why it's there or anything like that?
Wow. I have to think on that one. I mean, we tracked everything down. I mean,
that was trackable.
I have to think on that one. That's a good question. I mean, there are buildings, for instance, at Little Bon Terre Library. We don't know the architect of that. We don't know.
Right.
And I'm sure there are other examples I'm not thinking of right now, that where the scholarship remains to be done. Drill down deeper.
Yeah.
Yeah. We only live so long.
I know, I'm amazed.
Anyway. Yeah.
Yep.
So do you have plans to
No,
donate?
I'm sorry.
To donate all of your files of all these drafts and all the old
Oh,
photographs to what?
well,
Society or?
Cole is very methodical. I wouldn't give my papers to anybody because they're like hieroglyphics. But Ozzy has a collection at the State Historical Society. That hasn't been discussed.
Yeah. Ozzy has his.
Yeah.
You said the book's available on the UVA website. Can you be a little more specific about that website?
Sure. Give me a second, stretch for time.
Yep, we're about done. University of Virginia Press.
Yeah, University of Virginia Press,
Okay.
upress.virginia.edu. So upress.virginia.edu.
Okay, time's up, I think. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for being
Wonderful.
here.
Oh, here. One little extra, there we go. Low resolution, but still.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. It was really interesting. Thanks to everyone for coming out tonight. The Steedman lecture continues in October. October 28th will be Andy Hahn will be giving a talk called Mapping St. Louis. So I'm looking forward to that. Hope you can all make it out, and hope you all have a good evening. Thanks for coming.
I guess I missed it at the beginning, because Councilman still with us, or is
No,
that
he's gone. 2003 election.